A Japanese POW young girl returned 30 years later to thank her Black American guard for his goodwill. September 7th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The transport truck's engine coughed twice before dying, leaving 16-year-old Yuki Takahashi sitting in sudden silence among 43 other Japanese prisoners of war. Through the canvas covering, she could see nothing but knew everything. America, the land of demons, waited outside. Her fingers traced the torn edge of her civilian dress, now stained with oil and sweat from 3 weeks of ocean crossing. The propaganda had been clear since childhood. Americans were barbarians who would torture prisoners, who would violate women, who would show no mercy to the conquered. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind as American soldiers had dragged her from their village near Hiroshima. "They will kill you slowly. Better to die fighting." The canvas flap opened. Yuki closed her eyes, waiting for rifle butts, for shouted curses, for violence. Instead, a calm voice spoke in careful, broken Japanese. "Please step down. Slowly. No one will hurt you. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. She opened her eyes to see a Black American soldier standing at the truck's rear gate. He wore the same uniform as the others, carried the same rifle, but his face held no hatred. His name tag read, Lawson. He extended his hand to help prisoners down from the high truck bed. Most refused, jumping instead, unwilling to touch the enemy. Yuki watched an elderly man stumble and fall. Private Henry Lawson caught him before he hit the ground. The camp spread before them like a small city. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, painted white, their windows intact and screened against insects. Electric lights blazed from every building despite the afternoon sun. Beyond the fence, she could see civilian homes, automobiles parked in driveways, children riding bicycles. No bomb damage, no burned buildings, no signs of war's destruction. Inside Japan, cities lay in ruins. Hiroshima had vanished in atomic fire just 1 month earlier. Tokyo was ash. Yokohama was rubble. Yet here, in the enemy's homeland, life continued as if war existed only in distant newsreels. The mathematics made no sense. Japan had been told America was weakening. That victory remained possible. The pristine camp and undamaged town beyond told a different truth. The processing began immediately. American efficiency, Yuki would learn, operated on principles incomprehensible to those raised in wartime scarcity. Medical examinations by doctors who showed no disgust at treating enemy prisoners. Delousing showers with hot water and soap that actually lathered. Clean clothes, American military surplus, but whole and warm. A medical officer documented her injuries, minor cuts and bruises from capture, with the same care he would show an American soldier. Private Lawson remained nearby throughout processing, never intrusive, but always present. When an elderly woman collapsed, from exhaustion, he carried her to the medical station himself. When a young boy refused to eat, terrified the food was poisoned, Lawson ate from the same bowl first, then offered it again. The boy ate. That first evening, Yuki received her bunk assignment in Barracks 7. Each prisoner had an individual bed with a mattress, not the bare boards she expected. Clean blankets, a pillow. The American Red Cross had provided basic toiletries, toothbrush, soap, comb. These items sat in a small box at the foot of each bed, distributed equally to every prisoner. As darkness fell, electric lights illuminated the barracks. Yuki lay on her bunk, unable to sleep, listening to fellow prisoners whisper in confusion. This was not the America they had been taught to expect. This was not the torture they had prepared to endure. The disconnect between expectation and reality created a cognitive dissonance that no training, no propaganda, no preparation had equipped them to process. Through the window, she could see Private Lawson walking his patrol route. His silhouette passed regularly, a dark shape against the camp's lights. He walked slowly, without menace, just a soldier performing his duty. Yuki wondered what he thought about, this black American guard watching over Japanese prisoners in the middle of Wisconsin. She wondered if he hated them. She wondered why, if he did, his actions showed only kindness. September 8th, 1945, 5:30 in the morning. The wake-up call at Camp McCoy came not from shouted orders or rifle fire, but from a simple bell. Yuki woke to find the barracks already stirring, women around her rising quietly, folding blankets with the precision learned from years of regimented Japanese life. The mess hall operated with American abundance that defied comprehension. Hot oatmeal, not the watery rice gruel of Japanese military rations. Fresh milk, a luxury most prisoners had not seen in years. White bread, butter, jam, coffee with real sugar. The portions exceeded what Japanese civilians received even before the war. Private Lawson stood near the serving line, not eating, just watching. When an elderly prisoner struggled to carry her tray, he stepped forward immediately. He guided her to a seat, returned with napkins she had forgotten, ensured she had everything needed before moving away. The other guards remained distant, performing their duties with military correctness but no warmth. Lawson was different. Yuki observed him throughout that first full day. He moved through the camp with quiet competence, speaking to prisoners in his broken Japanese, learning names, remembering faces. The other soldiers called him Henry. She heard them joking with him, but also heard the edge in some voices. Not all Americans, she realized, were comfortable with a black man showing such humanity to enemy prisoners. The camp library surprised her most. Books in Japanese, donated by American churches and civic organizations. Newspapers, censored but recent, showing world events. Educational materials for those who wished to learn English. The Americans were not just housing prisoners, they were treating them as human beings, worthy of dignity and intellectual stimulation. That afternoon, during outdoor recreation time, Yuki sat alone under a tree, watching children play. Camp McCoy held families, rare in prisoner-of-war facilities. Japanese-American soldiers serving as translators had convinced military authorities that separating families would violate humanitarian principles. So mothers stayed with children, elderly with relatives. Henry approached slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. He carried something in his hand, wrapped in paper. When he was close enough, he extended it toward her. She flinched instinctively. He stopped, patient, waiting. Finally, curiosity overcame fear. She took the package. Inside was a Hershey bar, chocolate, thick and dark, American manufacturing at its most decadent. In Japan, chocolate had disappeared from civilian markets in 1941, 4 years since she had tasted sweetness beyond rationed sugar, 4 years since childhood treats had been anything but distant memory. He said nothing, just nodded once and walked away. Yuki stared at the chocolate bar for several minutes before breaking off a small piece. The taste exploded across her tongue, rich and sweet and impossibly indulgent. She began to cry, unable to stop herself, overwhelmed by the gesture's simple kindness. Later that evening, she learned more about Private Henry Lawson from other prisoners who had begun collecting information about their captors. He was from Louisiana, a state in the American South. He had joined the military in 1942. He faced discrimination from white soldiers, was often assigned the least desirable duties, was passed over for promotions despite clear competence. Yet he maintained his dignity, performed his work with excellence, and showed more humanity to prisoners than men who faced no such obstacles. The contradiction troubled her deeply. Imperial propaganda had taught that Americans viewed all non-whites as inferior, that racial hatred defined American society. Yet here was a man who experienced that hatred daily, who had every reason for bitterness, showing kindness to enemy prisoners who had been taught to see him as subhuman. That night, Yuki lay in her bunk, holding the chocolate wrapper, smoothed flat and folded carefully. The barracks around her buzzed with quiet conversations as prisoners processed their first full day. The food was too good, the treatment too fair, the conditions too comfortable. Something must be wrong. This must be a trick, a psychological operation designed to extract intelligence or confessions. But Yuki had seen Henry's face when he gave her the chocolate. There was no calculation there, no manipulation. Just a man who saw a frightened girl and wanted to offer comfort. The simplicity of that human connection challenged everything she had been raised to believe. If Americans could be kind, if Black Americans could show mercy to Japanese prisoners despite their own suffering, then what else had been lies? What other truths had propaganda obscured? September 14th, 1945. 1 week at Camp McCoy had systematically demolished every expectation Yuki carried from Japan. The mathematics of American prisoner treatment defied Japanese military logic entirely. 3 meals daily totaling over 3,000 calories, medical care exceeding what Japanese soldiers received in field hospitals, educational opportunities surpassing what many Japanese civilians could access. The camp operated with Geneva Convention protocols that Camp Commandant Captain John Roberts enforced rigidly. No physical punishment, no verbal abuse, no forced labor beyond basic camp maintenance. Prisoners who wished to work could volunteer for paid positions at surrounding farms, earning 80 cents daily. This money could purchase additional items from the camp commissary, everything from writing paper to toiletries to candy. Yuki volunteered for kitchen duty, wanting to understand American food systems. The waste shocked her. Bread crusts trimmed from sandwiches and discarded. Milk slightly past freshness date poured down drains. Vegetables with minor blemishes rejected for prisoner meals, sent instead to local pig farms. Americans destroyed more food daily than her entire village consumed weekly. But it was the systematic kindness that truly unsettled her worldview. Private Lawson remained a constant presence, his quiet competence creating safety where propaganda promised only danger. She watched him intervene when a younger guard grew impatient with an elderly prisoner who moved too slowly. Watched him spend his own money at the commissary to buy crayons for children in the camp. Watched him sit with a dying man, holding his hand through his final hours, though they shared no common language. Other prisoners began sharing stories of American treatment during capture and transport. Saito Katsu, a former schoolteacher from Osaka, had been captured at sea when his transport ship was sunk. American sailors had pulled Japanese survivors from the water, administered first aid, shared their own rations during the rescue voyage. This mercy toward enemies actively trying to kill them hours earlier contradicted every principle of Bushido Yuki had been taught. The psychological impact of sustained kindness proved more devastating than any torture could have been. Propaganda crumbled under daily exposure to American humanity. The cognitive dissonance created physical symptoms among prisoners. Some couldn't eat. Certain food must be poisoned despite watching Americans consume identical meals. Some couldn't sleep, waiting for the inevitable betrayal that never came. Some withdrew entirely, unable to reconcile their beliefs with observed reality. Yuki found herself caught between worlds. Her loyalty to Japan remained unshaken. Her father had died in the Philippines. Her brother served somewhere in the Pacific. Her mother lived under American occupation in Hiroshima's ruins. Yet here she stood, eating American food, sleeping in American shelter, receiving American mercy. The contradiction created shame that sat heavy in her chest. Private Samuel Jones, Henry's closest friend among the guards, began teaching basic English to prisoners who wished to learn. Samuel was younger than Henry, less comfortable initially with showing kindness to former enemies. But Henry's example gradually changed him. Yuki watched this transformation, saw one man's compassion inspiring another, creating ripples of humanity that spread through the camp. The other guards ranged from professionally distant to barely concealed hostile. Some muttered about coddling the enemy. Others questioned why they should treat Japanese prisoners well when American prisoners in Japan faced starvation and brutality. These men performed their duties correctly, but showed no warmth. The contrast with Henry and Samuel became more stark as days passed. Captain Roberts maintained order through moral authority rather than fear. When a guard was caught verbally abusing a prisoner, Roberts transferred him immediately. When supplies ran short, Roberts ensured prisoners received their full allotments before American personnel. He ran the camp according to regulations, yes, but also according to principles that valued human dignity above nationality. The camp library became Yuki's refuge. American magazines showed a society continuing normal life while fighting global war. Advertisements for automobiles, household appliances, cosmetics, articles about sports, entertainment, fashion. This casual abundance during wartime revealed industrial capacity that made Japanese material scarcity seem inevitable rather than noble sacrifice. America was not suffering. America was not struggling. America was conducting business as usual while simultaneously crushing its enemies under overwhelming material superiority. One afternoon, Henry found Yuki crying in the library. She had been reading a magazine article about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The American account described the military necessity, the Japanese refusal to surrender, the estimated lives saved by ending the war quickly. The cold logic of mass death presented as humanitarian mathematics. September 21st, 1945. The autumn air had begun to cool Wisconsin's forests, bringing temperatures that reminded Yuki of home. But nothing else about Camp McCoy resembled the Japan she remembered. 2 weeks of American captivity had revealed truths more devastating than any battlefield defeat. She had discovered that Private Henry Lawson faced discrimination that would have been familiar to any Japanese person designated as inferior by their own society. The other soldiers often gave him the worst assignments. They ate in segregated sections of the mess hall. They made jokes that carried undertones of hatred wrapped in humor's acceptable disguise. Yet Henry maintained dignity that put his tormentors to shame. Yuki began observing the complex racial hierarchies within American military culture. White soldiers held most positions of authority. Black soldiers like Henry and Samuel performed support roles, guard duty, manual labor. They were American citizens, wore American uniforms, fought for American victory, yet were treated as second class within their own army. The parallel to Japan's treatment of Koreans and Chinese was impossible to ignore. This recognition created uncomfortable questions. If Japan condemned American racism while practicing its own racial superiority, what moral authority had imperial propaganda possessed? If American racism didn't prevent individual Americans like Henry from showing humanity across racial lines, what did that say about Japanese teachings that race determined capacity for civilization? Henry had begun teaching her English words during his evening patrols. Simple phrases. Good morning. Thank you. How are you? His patient repetition, his genuine pleasure when she pronounced something correctly, his careful correction without condescension, all demonstrated teaching skills that transcended language barriers. She learned later he had taught elementary school before the war, until Louisiana's segregated system and poverty wages forced him to seek military service. The chocolate had become a weekly gift. Every Sunday evening, Henry would find her during recreation time and quietly hand her a Hershey bar. She had tried to refuse after the first time, understanding that his private's pay barely covered his own needs. He had simply smiled and walked away, leaving the chocolate on the bench beside her. The gesture's consistency mattered more than the gift itself. Other prisoners noticed Henry's attention toward Yuki. Some warned her about becoming too friendly with the enemy. Others suggested she was receiving special treatment that shamed their collective national dignity. Saito Katsu, however, understood. He told her that rejecting kindness because of the giver's nationality was allowing propaganda to win even in defeat. The camp received newspapers regularly now, Japanese language editions printed by American authorities, showing the occupation's progress. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender, but seeing the formal documents, reading the terms, understanding the total nature of defeat, created fresh grief. Everything her father died for, everything her brother fought for, everything her mother suffered for, had ended in unconditional surrender. Yet here at Camp McCoy, defeat looked nothing like the apocalypse propaganda had predicted. American occupation of Japan was proceeding without mass executions, without systematic rape, without the destruction of Japanese culture. General MacArthur was implementing democratic reforms while preserving the emperor. Food aid was arriving. Medicine was being distributed. The demons of propaganda were feeding the conquered. This cognitive dissonance reached its breaking point one evening when Yuki finally understood the full implications of American industrial capacity. A documentary film shown to prisoners as part of re-education programming displayed American war production. One aircraft carrier every month, a bomber every hour, a tank every 7 minutes. This production occurred while Americans ate well, lived comfortably, and maintained civilian consumption that exceeded Japanese peacetime standards. Japan had never stood a chance. The Bushido spirit, the warrior's willingness to die, the national determination to fight until the last citizen fell, all these values meant nothing against industrial capacity so vast it could casually destroy enemies while barely disrupting domestic comfort. The realization was crushing. September 28, 1945. 3 weeks since Yuki's arrival at Camp McCoy. 3 weeks of systematic demolition of everything she believed about enemies, about America, about the war's meaning. The weight of these revelations had been building pressure behind her carefully maintained composure. Tonight, that dam finally broke. It began with a letter. The Red Cross had located her mother in Hiroshima. The news was devastating. Radiation sickness, severe burns, starvation conditions. Her mother was alive, but suffering in ways that made death seem merciful. The letter had taken weeks to reach Wisconsin, processed through military channels, censored, translated, then delivered by Captain Roberts personally. Yuki read the letter in her bunk after evening meal. The other prisoners gave her space, understanding that grief demanded privacy. But privacy couldn't contain the wave of emotion that crashed over her. The guilt of being fed while her mother starved. The shame of receiving kindness while her mother received radiation's slow death. The crushing injustice that she, the prisoner, lived better than the victor suffering under atomic aftermath. She walked outside, unable to remain in the barracks, needing air and space and darkness to hide her breakdown. The camp's lights blazed as always, but she found shadows near the perimeter fence, as far from other people as regulations allowed. There, finally alone, she began to cry in earnest. Not quiet tears, but racking sobs that shook her entire body. All the fear, all the confusion, all the pain she had suppressed since capture poured out at once. She didn't hear Henry approach. He moved quietly, as always, respecting her need for privacy while ensuring her safety. When she finally noticed his presence, she expected him to leave, to give her space, to pretend he hadn't witnessed her collapse. Instead, he did something that defied every cultural and military boundary. He sat down on the ground, a respectful distance away, and simply waited, not speaking, not offering empty comfort, just present, just there, his silent companionship saying more than words could express. You are not alone. Your pain matters. Your humanity transcends our uniforms. After several minutes, Yuki's sobs began to subside. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, embarrassed by the display, ashamed of her weakness. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. He extended it toward her, not approaching closer, just offering. She took it, dried her face, and for the first time looked directly at him as a person rather than a guard. In broken English and simpler Japanese, she told him about the letter, about her mother, about Hiroshima, about the guilt that consumed her. Henry listened without interruption, his face reflecting genuine compassion for enemy suffering. When she finished, he spoke slowly in his limited Japanese, choosing words carefully. War hurt everyone. No one chose this. But kindness possible even in darkness. Your mother would want you alive and safe. Honor her by living well. The simplicity of his response cut through weeks of accumulated confusion. He wasn't offering political justification for atomic bombs. He wasn't defending American actions or condemning Japanese ones. He was simply acknowledging shared humanity across the artificial boundaries war created. He saw her pain as real regardless of nationality. He offered comfort without expecting anything in return. They sat together in companionable silence as full darkness fell over Wisconsin. Other guards passed on patrol, glancing at them curiously but saying nothing. This moment existed outside normal protocols, a space where human connection mattered more than military hierarchy or national identity. Finally, Henry stood slowly, indicating through gesture that she should return to the barracks before evening count. But before leaving, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out something wrapped in paper. Another Hershey bar. He placed it gently in her hand, squeezed her shoulder once in brotherly comfort, then walked away into the darkness. Yuki stood alone, holding the chocolate, Henry's handkerchief, and a new understanding of what compassion could mean. This man who faced discrimination from his own countrymen, who served in a segregated military, who had every reason for bitterness about his own treatment, still found space in his heart to comfort an enemy prisoner grieving her mother's suffering. The grace of that transcended everything propaganda had taught her about racial hierarchy, about enemy nature, about who deserved humanity. She returned to the barracks and placed the chocolate in her small storage box, alongside the previous wrappers she had saved. These fragments of foil and paper had become sacred objects, physical evidence that mercy existed even in hatred's depths. That individual humans could rise above their society's prejudices. That kindness could flow upward even against gravity's cultural pull. That night, Yuki wrote her first letter to her mother since capture. She described the camp truthfully. The food, the shelter, the medical care, the surprising humanity. She told her mother about Henry, about his weekly chocolate gifts, about his quiet presence during her darkest moment. She confessed her confusion, her guilt, her gradual realization that enemies might be human too. October 5th, 1945. 4 weeks at Camp McCoy had transformed Yuki's understanding of captivity. But nothing prepared her for the morning Private Henry Lawson arrived at kitchen duty, carrying a small notebook and pencil. He approached during the breakfast cleanup, when the other guards were distracted, and opened the notebook to show her carefully written Japanese characters. "Good morning. Thank you. Please. You are welcome." The handwriting was awkward, each character drawn with obvious effort, but the intention was unmistakable. Henry was learning her language, not the broken phrases he already knew, but proper written Japanese that required hours of study. Yuki stared at the notebook, then at Henry. His face showed neither pride nor expectation, just quiet determination. She understood immediately what this represented. American soldiers were not required to learn prisoner languages. Most viewed such effort as beneath them, unnecessary fraternization with defeated enemies. Yet here was Henry, spending his limited free time studying a complex writing system to communicate more effectively with people his country had been killing months earlier. She took the pencil from his hand and wrote beneath his characters. "Your writing is improving. Keep practicing." Henry smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, transforming his usually serious face into something younger, almost boyish. He pointed to the characters one by one, asking her to pronounce them. She did, slowly, watching him mouth the sounds silently, committing them to memory. This became their morning ritual. Henry would arrive during kitchen duty with new phrases he had learned, and Yuki would correct his pronunciation and writing. In return, she began learning English more seriously, moving beyond simple commands to actual conversation. The language exchange created a space where guard and prisoner could meet as teacher and student rather than captor and captive. Through these conversations, Yuki learned more about Henry's life in Louisiana. He described a childhood marked by poverty and segregation, where colored and white signs divided every public space. He told her about schools that received cast-off textbooks from white schools, their pages already worn and outdated. He explained how his father had worked sharecropping land owned by white families, essentially slavery by another name, barely earning enough to feed his children. Yet Henry spoke without bitterness. He described his mother's determination that her children would receive education despite systematic obstacles. How she had taught him to read before he started school, using a Bible and whatever newspapers she could acquire. How his teacher, a black woman educated at Tuskegee Institute, had recognized his intelligence and pushed him toward books that opened worlds beyond Louisiana's suffocating racism. Yuki began sharing her own stories. Her village near Hiroshima, where everyone knew everyone, where community festivals marked the seasons, where her father had been a respected craftsman making traditional pottery. She told Henry about her mother's flower arranging, the precise art of ikebana that found beauty in simplicity. She described her brother, 3 years older, who had joined the military with enthusiasm born from propaganda that promised glory and honor. Through these exchanges, they discovered unexpected parallels. Both had been taught that other races were inferior. Both had been raised in societies that used nationalism to justify discrimination. Both had lost family members to a war that now seemed senseless from their current perspective. The discovery that their respective propagandas had taught similar lies created a bond deeper than shared language. Private Samuel Jones began joining these morning sessions, initially skeptical but gradually drawn in by Henry's patience and Yuki's willingness to teach. Samuel was from Georgia, where segregation ran even deeper than Louisiana. He had joined the military hoping to escape Southern racism, only to discover the Army simply moved it north and west. Yet watching Henry show kindness to former enemies had begun changing Samuel's view of who deserved compassion. Other prisoners noticed these interactions. Some approved, seeing language learning as practical skill that might ease camp life. Others disapproved, viewing any friendship with captors as betrayal of Japanese honor. Saito Katsu, the older teacher, became Yuki's defender when criticism grew too harsh. He argued that understanding one's former enemies was not betrayal, but wisdom, that learning from defeat required abandoning the pride that had led to catastrophic war. October 19, 1945. The first snow of Wisconsin's autumn fell on Camp McCoy, transforming the compound into a landscape that reminded Yuki of Japanese woodblock prints. The white covering softened barbed wire fences, made guard towers look almost decorative, turned a prisoner of war camp into something approaching beautiful. But beauty could not hide the letters that arrived weekly from Japan, each one bringing news worse than the last. The American occupation was proceeding peacefully, yes, but the devastation underneath that peace was total. Cities remained in ruins. Food shortages approached starvation levels. The radiation effects from Hiroshima and Nagasaki were revealing themselves in horrifying ways, bodies breaking down months after exposure. Yuki's mother's letters had stopped coming. The Red Cross reported communication. Difficulties in Hiroshima. Nothing definite, just silence where weekly updates had been. That silence spoke louder than any confirmation could. Yuki found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep, trapped in guilty certainty that her mother had died while she lived comfortably in enemy captivity. Henry found her in the library one afternoon, staring at a book she was not reading. He sat down across from her without speaking, waiting as he always did, giving her space to share or remain silent as she chose. Finally, she told him about the letters stopping, about her mother's radiation sickness, about the probability that she was now an orphan with father dead in Philippines, brother missing in Pacific, mother gone to atomic aftermath. Henry listened without offering false comfort. He did not say things would be fine. He did not promise her mother was alive. He simply acknowledged her pain as real and valid. Then he told her about his own loss. His younger brother had died at Normandy, killed on June 6, 1944, during the invasion that had begun Germany's defeat. Henry had learned about it 3 months later, a telegram arriving at camp that destroyed him for weeks. The parallel was not exact. Henry's brother had died as a soldier in combat. Yuki's mother was a civilian killed by weapon that vaporized cities. But the grief was identical. The loss transcended the circumstances. They sat together in shared mourning, guard and prisoner united by death's democracy that claimed both American soldiers and Japanese civilians with equal indifference. This conversation opened new understanding between them. Henry began explaining the racism he faced not just as historical fact, but as daily lived experience. He described how white soldiers received promotions he was denied despite superior performance, how he was assigned the worst duties, regardless of rank, how officers spoke to him with barely concealed contempt while praising less competent white soldiers. He told her about an incident 2 weeks earlier. A white private had struck a Japanese prisoner during an argument. Captain Roberts had immediately disciplined the soldier. But when Henry reported a white sergeant for similar behavior, Roberts had dismissed it as misunderstanding, unwilling to take a black soldier's word against a white sergeant's denial. The double standard was absolute. Yuki recognized this pattern. In Japanese-occupied territories, Korean and Chinese laborers had faced similar treatment. Superior Japanese performance meant promotion and reward. Superior Korean performance meant suspicion and closer oversight. The parallel systems of racial hierarchy operated on identical logic despite claiming different justifications. These conversations attracted other prisoners. Saito Katsu began joining their library sessions, sharing his own observations about racial dynamics he had witnessed during Japan's colonial period. A young prisoner named Hiro, barely 14, listened, intently, his worldview being formed by these discussions, rather than propaganda that had shaped his elders. Samuel also participated, initially uncomfortable discussing race with former enemies, but gradually opening up about his own experiences. He described growing up in rural Georgia, where lynching remained common, where accusations against black men required no evidence, where justice was a luxury afforded only to white citizens. The horror of these stories shocked the Japanese prisoners, who had been taught American democracy promised equality under law. Through these exchanges, both groups discovered their societies had taught them lies. Not lies about everything, but lies about enough. Lies about racial superiority. Lies about enemy inhumanity. Lies about the moral righteousness of their respective causes. The propaganda had contained truth mixed with falsehood in proportions that made separation difficult, but extended contact with reality gradually revealed which parts were which. November 2nd, 1945. Yuki had been at Camp McCoy for 8 weeks. 8 weeks that had demolished her worldview so completely that returning to it seemed impossible. She sat in the mess hall during lunch, watching Henry move between tables, checking that prisoners received proper portions, ensuring elderly prisoners had assistance, maintaining order through presence rather than force. A new prisoner arrived that morning, transferred from a camp in California. His name was Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, a naval officer captured when his submarine was depth-charged off Midway. Unlike the civilians and enlisted men at McCoy, Yamamoto carried himself with rigid military bearing that refused to acknowledge defeat. He sat apart from other prisoners, ate in silence, and glared at anyone who showed friendliness toward American guards. Yuki recognized the type immediately. Yamamoto embodied the Bushido ideal she had been raised to admire. Unwavering loyalty, absolute dedication, preference for death over surrender's dishonor. 2 months earlier, she would have aspired to his example. Now she saw only brittle pride that served no purpose except preventing adaptation to changed circumstances. That afternoon, Yamamoto approached her in the recreation yard. He had learned she spoke some English, that she helped translate for other prisoners, that she had developed something resembling friendship with the American guards. His words were cold and precise. You shame yourself and our nation by fraternizing with the enemy. Yuki felt the accusation like a physical blow. The guilt she had been suppressing rushed forward. Was she betraying Japan by accepting American kindness? Did learning English constitute collaboration? Did Henry's chocolate bars make her a traitor? The questions had haunted her since arrival, but Yamamoto's direct confrontation forced them into the open. Saito Katsu overheard the exchange and intervened. He explained to Yamamoto that survival required adaptation, that prisoners who maintained rigid hostility toward captors only made their own lives harder without accomplishing anything useful. Yamamoto dismissed this as coward's rationalization, insisting that true Japanese spirit meant never accepting defeat, never cooperating with enemies, never acknowledging that Bushido had failed. Henry witnessed this confrontation from his guard post, but did not interfere. Camp policy allowed prisoners to resolve internal disputes unless violence occurred. But that evening, during their language lesson, he addressed it indirectly. He told Yuki about soldiers he had known who confused stubbornness with strength, who believed admitting mistakes showed weakness, who died unnecessarily because pride prevented them from adapting to battlefield realities. The parallel was clear. Yamamoto's refusal to accept changed circumstances resembled soldiers who charged machine gun positions rather than admit their tactics had become obsolete. It was courage pointed in wrong directions, bravery wasted on impossible objectives, strength undermined by inability to recognize when strength had become liability. But Yamamoto's arrival accomplished something unexpected. His rigid adherence to pre-surrender ideology made other prisoners realize how much they had already changed. His contempt for American kindness highlighted how much they had come to appreciate it. His anger at fraternization revealed how normal such interaction had become. Yamamoto was a mirror reflecting their transformation, and most prisoners did not like what that reflection revealed about their former selves. Over the following days, Yamamoto continued his campaign of resistance. He refused to work, citing Geneva Convention provisions that officers need not perform labor. He organized prayer sessions honoring the emperor. He lectured younger prisoners about maintaining Japanese spirit in captivity. Some listened respectfully. Most ignored him. A few actively avoided him. Yuki found herself in an impossible position. She understood Yamamoto's perspective because she had held it herself weeks earlier. She recognized his pride as defense mechanism against humiliation of defeat. She knew his rigidity came from fear that flexibility meant losing identity. But she also knew that Henry's kindness was real, that Captain Roberts ran a fair camp, that American treatment of prisoners exceeded anything propaganda had predicted. The conflict reached a crisis point when Yamamoto accused Yuki directly of being a collaborator, using a Japanese word that carried implications of sexual betrayal alongside political treason. The accusation was doubly devastating because it exploited cultural assumptions about women's honor and raised questions about Henry's intentions that Yuki knew were unfounded, but could not easily refute without seeming defensive. November 9, 1945. The accusation hung over Yuki like smoke, impossible to dispel completely. Other prisoners knew Yamamoto's charge was baseless, that Henry had shown only proper respect, that nothing inappropriate had occurred. But the mere suggestion had poisoned something pure, had taken innocent kindness and twisted it into something shameful through implication alone. Yuki stopped attending the morning language lessons. She avoided Henry during his patrols. She remained in her barracks during recreation time, rather than risk encountering him. The withdrawal was not because she believed Yamamoto's accusations, but because she understood how appearances mattered more than truth in situations where rumor could destroy reputation. A 16-year-old Japanese girl spending time with a Black American guard would be interpreted through whatever lens observers chose, and those lenses were ground from prejudices neither party could control. Henry noticed her absence immediately. He asked Saito Katsu if Yuki was ill. Saito, protective of her reputation, said only that she needed space. Henry accepted this without pushing, demonstrating the same respect for boundaries that had characterized all his interactions, but his concern was visible to those who knew him. Samuel mentioned that Henry seemed distracted on patrol, that his usual attentiveness had been replaced by preoccupied silence. Meanwhile, Yamamoto continued his resistance campaign. He began organizing what he called loyalty groups among prisoners, informal gatherings where they would discuss maintaining Japanese identity in captivity. These sessions gradually evolved into planning meetings for something more ambitious. Yamamoto was planning an escape. The plan was suicidal. Camp McCoy was located in central Wisconsin, hundreds of miles from any ocean, surrounded by terrain that would kill unprepared escapees through exposure alone. Winter was coming. Temperatures already dropped below freezing at night. Snow would soon make travel impossible without proper equipment. Even if escapees somehow reached a coast, they had no means of contacting Japan, no way of crossing the Pacific, no realistic hope of accomplishing anything except dying uncomfortably. But Yamamoto insisted that dying free was preferable to living as prisoner. He argued that Bushido demanded the attempt regardless of outcome, that surrender had been dishonorable, and escape would restore some measure of dignity. He recruited 3 other prisoners to join him, All were young men susceptible to appeals about honor and shame. None had families waiting in Japan. All felt the aimlessness of captivity more acutely than fear of death. Yuki learned about the plan by accident. She overheard Yamamoto discussing it with one of his recruits in the barracks. The young man, barely 17, was expressing doubt about timing. Yamamoto was insisting they move before snow made escape impossible. Yuki realized they planned to attempt escape within days, possibly within hours. She faced an immediate moral crisis. Japanese loyalty demanded. She remained silent. Allow countrymen to pursue what they defined as honor, respect their autonomy even if their plan seemed foolish. But she had spent 2 months learning that American captivity was not the fate worse than death that propaganda had promised. She knew these young men would die in Wisconsin's forests for no purpose except Yamamoto's rigid ideology. More complicated still was the question of whom to tell. Captain Roberts would be appropriate through official channels, but approaching him directly would mark her permanently as informant. Samuel might help, but he would be required to report it immediately. That left Henry, whose discretion she trusted, but whose involvement would confirm Yamamoto's accusations about inappropriate closeness between them. The decision tortured her through a sleepless night. She had been taught since childhood that loyalty to fellow Japanese exceeded all other obligations, that protecting countrymen from consequences of their actions was fundamental duty. But she had also learned that loyalty could be misplaced, that protecting people from consequences sometimes meant enabling their self-destruction, that true friendship sometimes required difficult interventions. By dawn, she had made her decision. She found Henry during his morning patrol and asked to speak privately. He followed her to the library, maintaining appropriate distance, his face neutral but concerned. She told him about Yamamoto's plan, about the timing, about the certainty that these young men would die if they succeeded in escaping. She asked him not to reveal how he learned about it, knowing that request put him in difficult position regarding military protocol. Henry listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Why are you telling me?" Yuki had prepared an answer about preventing unnecessary deaths, about valuing mercy over loyalty, about believing human life mattered more than national pride. But when the moment came, she gave a simpler truth. "Because you taught me that kindness is stronger than ideology." November 10th, 1945. Henry reported the escape plan to Captain Roberts privately, saying only that he had received information from a reliable source. Roberts increased guard patrols without explanation, positioning soldiers at likely exit points, disrupting Yamamoto's timing without revealing the plan had been discovered. The escape attempt never materialized because the conditions that would have made it possible never emerged. Yamamoto knew immediately that someone had informed. His accusations fell on Yuki despite her careful efforts to avoid suspicion. Perhaps he simply assumed the most obvious target. Perhaps he had seen her speaking privately with Henry. Perhaps her previous interactions with American guards made her the convenient scapegoat. Regardless of reasoning, Yamamoto declared her a traitor and demanded other prisoners shun her completely. The response split the prisoner population. Some followed Yamamoto's directive, viewing Yuki as collaborator who had prevented honorable action. Others defended her, arguing that preventing suicidal escape was mercy rather than betrayal. Saito Katsu spoke forcefully in her defense, pointing out that saving lives should be valued over preserving pride. But the division was real and painful. Yuki found herself isolated within the camp. Prisoners who had been friendly now avoided her. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Meals became lonely affairs, as others refused to sit nearby. The psychological impact of this shunning was worse than any physical punishment could have been. She had saved lives and been condemned for it. She had chosen mercy and been labeled traitor. Henry watched this unfold with visible distress. He understood that his involvement, however indirect, had contributed to her isolation. He knew that their language lessons had provided Yamamoto with ammunition for his accusations. He recognized that his kindness toward her had inadvertently created a situation where doing the right thing resulted in community rejection. But he also knew he could not fix it. American Guard intervening on behalf of accused collaborator would only confirm suspicions rather than dispelling them. Captain Roberts could order prisoners to stop the shunning, but forced compliance would breed resentment rather than reconciliation. The situation had to resolve organically, or not at all. Samuel tried helping in his own way. He began learning Japanese more seriously, deliberately sitting with Yuki during the library hours when she studied alone. His presence as a second American guard, showing her respect, suggested that whatever Yamamoto accused her of doing was either false or considered appropriate by American standards. The gesture was kind, but insufficient to counter the broader shunning. 3 days after the failed escape plot, Yamamoto confronted Yuki directly in the recreation yard. He called her a traitor to the emperor, to Japan, to her ancestors. He said her parents would be ashamed if they knew she had become an American dog. He suggested she should commit suicide to restore her honor. The verbal assault was brutal and public, designed to humiliate her before the entire prisoner population. Yuki stood silent through the tirade, refusing to defend herself, knowing that any response would be twisted into further evidence of guilt. But Saitokatsu stepped forward and struck Yamamoto across the face. The blow shocked everyone present. Saito was elderly, scholarly, had never shown violence, yet he had hit a naval officer in defense of a teenage girl. Captain Roberts arrived within minutes, alerted by guards who had witnessed the incident. He separated Saito and Yamamoto, took statements from witnesses, and made his ruling quickly. Saito would face no punishment because he had acted in defense of another prisoner being verbally assaulted. Yamamoto would be placed in disciplinary barracks for 3 days for harassment and creating division among prisoners. The ruling shifted camp dynamics immediately. Roberts had officially recognized Yuki as victim rather than collaborator. He had punished Yamamoto for behavior that created problems for camp administration. He had signaled that continued shunning would not be tolerated as it disrupted camp harmony. The other prisoners understood these implications clearly, but Yamamoto's words had found their target. Yuki spent that night questioning everything she had done since arrival. Had she betrayed her country by accepting American kindness? Did preventing the escape constitute collaboration? Would her parents truly be ashamed? The doubts consumed her. Henry found her the next morning looking exhausted and defeated. He sat across from her in the library and told her a story about his own father, a man who had worked himself to death on land he never owned for people who never respected him, a man who had accepted his position because rebellion seemed impossible, a man who had died believing he had failed his children by not fighting back. Henry said his mother had different view. She believed his father had succeeded by keeping his family alive, by prioritizing survival over pride, by recognizing that sometimes acceptance of unjust situation was not weakness but wisdom. She had taught Henry that knowing when to fight and when to endure was true strength. The story's message was clear. Yuki had chosen survival over ideology, mercy over pride, practical compassion over abstract honor. These choices might be condemned by those who preferred dying nobly to living pragmatically, but they were not wrong. They were different values, not lesser ones. November 23, 1945. Thanksgiving arrived at Camp McCoy with all the abundance Yuki had come to associate with American holidays. turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, all served to prisoners of war with the same portions American guards received. The excess continued to shock her even after 2.5 months of witnessing it daily. But the holiday brought unexpected visitors. Representatives from the American Red Cross arrived with a delegation of Japanese American soldiers who had fought in Europe with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. These men, whose families had been imprisoned in camps while they fought for America, came to speak with prisoners about life in post-war Japan and opportunities for eventual repatriation. Among them was a translator named Robert Takahashi, no relation to Yuki despite sharing a surname. Robert had grown up in California, been imprisoned at Manzanar internment camp when the war began, volunteered for military service to prove Japanese-American loyalty, and fought through Italy and France with the most decorated unit in American military history. His story exemplified complexities that simple propaganda could never capture. Robert spoke to assembled prisoners about the dual nature of American society. He explained how the same country that imprisoned his family without trial had also allowed them to prove their worth through military service, how the nation that practiced racial discrimination had also recognized Japanese-American valor with more medals than any other unit, how democracy's promise remained unfulfilled in many ways, while still offering possibilities unavailable in other systems. His honesty surprised prisoners expecting either American propaganda or bitter condemnation. Instead, Robert presented nuanced reality that acknowledged both American failures and American potential. He talked about returning to California after the war to find his family's property had been stolen, their business destroyed, their savings depleted. But he also talked about laws being changed, about compensation being discussed, about gradual progress toward justice, even if that progress remained incomplete. Yuki listened intently, recognizing parallels to her own experience. Robert had served a country that discriminated against him, just as Henry did. Robert had maintained dignity despite injustice, just as Henry did. Robert had chosen to work within a flawed system, rather than rejecting it entirely, just as Henry did. The pattern suggested that human decency could exist within imperfect societies, that individual character mattered more than national ideology. After the formal presentation, Robert approached Yuki personally. Someone had told him about her situation, about Yamamoto's accusations, about the shunning she had endured. He wanted to offer perspective as someone who had navigated similar accusations of collaboration and betrayal from within Japanese-American community. He told her that during the war, some Japanese Americans had refused military service, arguing that serving a country that imprisoned their families was collaboration with racism. Others had volunteered enthusiastically, arguing that military service would prove Japanese American loyalty and help end discrimination. Both groups accused the other of betrayal, both claimed moral high ground, both believed their position was only ethical choice. Robert had concluded that neither side was entirely right or wrong, that complex situations permitted multiple valid responses, that people of good faith could disagree about proper course of action without either being traitor, that moral certainty was luxury available only to those not facing the actual choices. This conversation provided Yuki with framework for understanding her own situation. She had not betrayed Japan by accepting American kindness. She had not collaborated by preventing suicidal escape. She had simply made different choices than Yamamoto preferred, choices that prioritized life over death, mercy over pride, practical compassion over abstract honor. These were legitimate values, not character flaws. The Thanksgiving gathering also brought news from Japan that complicated prisoner perspectives further. The occupation was proceeding better than anyone had predicted. General MacArthur had preserved the emperor while implementing democratic reforms. Land redistribution was helping farmers. Labor unions were forming. Women had received voting rights for the first time. War crimes trials were proceeding, but without wholesale vengeance. More significantly, American food aid was preventing mass starvation. The same industrial capacity that had crushed Japan militarily was now feeding defeated population. Ships that had carried invasion forces now carried grain. Bombers that had destroyed cities now dropped supplies. The enemy that propaganda had promised would exterminate Japanese people was instead ensuring their survival. This created profound cognitive dissonance among prisoners. How could the demons of propaganda be feeding starving civilians? How could the barbarians be implementing reforms that benefited ordinary Japanese people more than militarist government ever had? How could defeat be leading to improvements in daily life that victory would never have delivered? These questions had no easy answers, but they forced prisoners to reconsider everything they believed about the war, about America, about their own government's propaganda. The revelations were painful but necessary, destroying comforting lies to make room for complicated truths. April 12, 1975. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Yuki Takahashi stood outside a modest house on Jefferson Street, her hands trembling despite the warm spring air. 30 years had passed since Camp McCoy. 30 years since she had last seen Private Henry Lawson. 30 years of carrying gratitude that words had never adequately expressed. Finding him had required months of effort. The American military kept records, but they were scattered across departments and decades. The Red Cross had helped. Veterans organizations had provided leads. Finally, a forwarding address in Louisiana had led her here, to a neighborhood where trees lined quiet streets and children played on sidewalks. She knocked twice. Footsteps approached slowly. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s, gray-haired but unmistakably the same person who had given chocolate to a frightened girl 3 decades earlier. Henry's eyes widened in recognition that defied the years between them. Yuki. His voice carried the same gentleness she remembered. He said her name as a statement, not a question, as if he had always known she would return someday. They sat in his living room, surrounded by photographs of grandchildren and mementos from a long life. Henry had returned to Louisiana after the war, worked as a teacher for 30 years, married, raised 4 children. His wife had passed 2 years earlier. He lived alone now but seemed content, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived. Yuki explained her journey. After repatriation in 1946, she had returned to Hiroshima to find her mother had indeed died from radiation sickness. She had rebuilt her life slowly, earned a university degree, become a translator working between American occupation forces and Japanese civilians. That work had evolved into a career facilitating cultural exchange, bringing Japanese students to America and American students to Japan. She had married a kind man who understood her past. They had 2 daughters who grew up hearing stories about the Black American Guard, who had shown mercy when mercy seemed impossible. Her work focused on reconciliation, on building bridges between former enemies, on proving that understanding could grow from conflict's ashes. But she had never forgotten the debt she owed. Henry's kindness had saved more than her life. It had saved her capacity for hope, her belief in human goodness, her faith that compassion could transcend hatred's boundaries. Without those lessons learned at Camp McCoy, she might have become bitter, might have carried hatred forward, might have taught her children that enemies could never become friends. Henry listened quietly, as he always had. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. I was just doing my job. Treating people right, that's not something you get thanked for. That's just being human. But Yuki understood what he did not. In a world that had taught him his humanity mattered less because of his skin color, in a military that discriminated against him while demanding his service. In a society that denied him equality while expecting his loyalty, Henry had chosen compassion anyway. He had given kindness to enemy prisoners when his own country withheld justice from him. That was not just doing his job. That was moral courage of the highest order. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were 30 Hershey bar wrappers, carefully preserved, each one folded and dated. The physical evidence of weekly gifts that had meant everything to a frightened girl in a foreign land. She had carried them through decades, across oceans, through marriage and motherhood and career, these fragile pieces of foil that represented hope's persistence in hatred's midst. Henry held the box in his weathered hands and began to cry. Quiet tears that spoke of memories he had carried too, of a war that had hurt everyone, of small kindnesses that had mattered more than either of them understood at the time. They spent the afternoon together, two people whose lives had intersected briefly during history's darkest period, but whose connection had proved more durable than the hatred that had created it. As evening approached and Yuki prepared to leave, Henry walked her to the door. "You did good," he said simply. "You took what happened and made something beautiful from it. That's all any of us can do." Yuki returned to Japan the following week, but she and Henry maintained correspondence until his death in 1982. His children told her he kept the box of chocolate wrappers on his bedside table, that he would sometimes take them out and remember a time when simple human decency had bridged an unbridgeable divide. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.